tonight and to host you all here in our centre, and also to see such a great turnout. So hopefully what I'll talk about is some of the things that Carly introduced earlier. This challenge that we have of whether mining and development can coexist, and what are the sort of discordant and sometimes divergent issues that arise when we think about those two topics together. So the first place to start is mining brings change. And it brings change in a lot of different dimensions. And the experience of change that people have is dependent on their relationship to the project, perhaps their values and interests, and also their different experiences and histories. So people's experience of change is different, and the change can be positive, it can be negative across lots of different dimensions. And when I think about change from mining, I think about it across 4 different dimensions. I think of the social and cultural change that can come, particularly changes in demographics in regions, because you've got an influx of workforce that perhaps didn't reside from that region. Mining demands particular sets of skills and services that don't usually originate in regional locations where mining is often placed. You also get changes, therefore, in the culture and customs of those locations from that changing demographic. You know, perhaps conflict over those things and issues of community identity. So if you've got an agricultural town that's now becoming a mining town, the identity of that town might be challenged, and that can bring different experiences in the social and cultural domain. Often in mining communities we see issues of crime and social disorder, particularly around in-migration that perhaps has not been a planned migration. Community health and safety issues can also arise, and key issue is social infrastructure and services. Often when you get a growth in mining development, you've got large influxes of fly-in, fly-out workforce perhaps, and the social infrastructure that's set up to service those communities can't cope with that change in demand. It takes a while for things to play out. The second dimension is that economic dimension, and it's the dimension that often is talked about as the positive, the benefits of mining, particularly jobs and employment, both direct employment and indirect employment, because mining usually has rather large multipliers compared to other industries because of its capital intense nature. And also around local business development and procurement. If procurement's set up right, it can be a driver for local development to service the mine in lots of different areas. There are also negatives associated with the economic dimension as well, and Carly mentioned inflation and deflation. That can happen at the macro scale for economies, currency appreciation and the like. It also can happen at the micro scale. You've got workforce working in the mining industry generating greater wages than perhaps other people in other sectors, and that can drive changes where goods and service prices may go up because of that workforce. Folks outside the industry can't afford it. Also, sectors outside of the industry can't get labour to service their particular sector, or if it's a local government, to service the services that are required in that location. The third dimension is an environmental dimension, but all environmental issues are experienced socially as well, so I think of it as a socio-environmental domain. And the key challenges in that domain are often pollution, the access and competition to resources, things like cultural heritage, but also amenity issues, whether it's disturbance from dust, noise, vibration, if it's in close proximity to local communities, or issues around the visual amenity that might change in a location. The fourth dimension, when I think about mining and change, is the process of change, and it's often forgotten that the way change comes about influences how change is experienced. If you're involved in the process of change, then you experience that change rather differently. So all of those issues of consultation and communication, agreement making, they influence how all these other changes are experienced as well. So moving from change to development, the off-sided example of where mining development has led to greater human development and greater regional development is northern Chile. And it's a location that I've done some work in, and my colleague Christian Parra in the audience has also done a significant amount of work in. So I thought we might use that as an example to tease out some of the issues that play out in the development domain. Now, northern Chile ought to be a place where mining has led to regional development and human development, because Chile as a whole contains 35% of world copper resources. That's more copper than OPEC has oil. So we're talking about a very large resource. Copper is a key ingredient to industrial economies and has been a key driver of development in places like India and China from the use of Chile's copper resources. It's not just Chile that's had lots of mining development over the past 2 decades, but mining has been a key driver of growth in Latin America. So mining GDP in Latin America has risen significantly since 1990 to the present and is projected to increase even further. And this is data that Christian has worked up in our centre. In Chile, the pulse was a little bit earlier than the rest of Latin America. So when Chile moved from a dictatorship, the Pinochet dictatorship from 73 to 89, into democracy in 1990, mining development followed. So you had Codelco, the state-owned mining company, already quite a significant generator of copper resources in Chile. You then had an expansion in the private sector from 1990 to the present. And what you tend to see from that change is there's an association between the large mining influx of investment, both from the state-owned company and private sector, and drop of poverty in the region. So what we've got here is poverty for Chile in 1990 and 2006, a huge drop. And looking at the 2 biggest regions of mining development, Tarapacá and Antofagasta, we also see concomitant drops, perhaps more pronounced in those mining regions than the rest of Chile. So at least we've got an association here that we could perhaps explore in more detail. We also see that in Tarapacá and Antofagasta, the GDP of those regions is up near first world levels, $30,000 a year. Whereas the rest of Chile, it's around $12,000. So this was an area Christian and I thought, well, let's explore this in a little bit more detail. So we looked at the $30,000 GDP and tried to compare, okay, well, what should we expect in Tarapacá and Antofagasta by way of human development and social progress if we were to compare it with other locations in the world that have a GDP of $30,000? Can we unpack that figure that on the surface looks like there's been a great amount of human and economic development in that region? And Christian and I have published this in a conference paper last year under Christian's lead authorship. So we said, okay, what are the targets that we should be setting ourselves if we were to compare it to these other locations? And what's the trend between what we've been doing in the last 10, 15 years? How long would it take us to get from here to there based on that trend? And poverty looks okay. So in that region, in 20 years' time, we'd probably reach a degree of poverty that's consistent with a GDP of $30,000. Education's a little bit more difficult. We're talking now half a century before the education standards in northern Chile would match a region that would have that GDP. Health, we're talking 2 centuries. So the health services are not, in any measure, comparable to what we should expect in that region. We also looked at a series of measures around local communities, and they were mainly due to the problem that in some local communities the poverty was much higher than the general poverty in those regions, and that poverty hadn't been declining. Obviously we know that there's contextual social factors, and we know that mining is a centralised large-scale development, so there's heaps of parts of that economy that aren't going to be affected by mining. And we also saw that the institutional investment in that region didn't match what we should expect. I think there's some understanding to that. So Chile's going to use its copper resource, which is in one geographic region, for the benefit of its whole society. So you can expect that it's going to use those resources and spread them out. But we can see that perhaps the picture is a little bit more complex than just saying that mining leads to greater change in social progress and human development. But there are trends there that can't be denied that there has been a change in that region.
What's your colour coding in that graph?
The colour coding is what we talked as income measures, education measures, health measures, measures for local communities and institutional measures. So not a coding that's the scale. In terms of community development, so we've seen the mining industry has really changed its approach in the last decade or so to make major investments in community development. And usually that development is delivered by the mining companies themselves, but sometimes is in partnerships with other development providers, because mining companies aren't development agencies, and that service can be provided better by other players. But still, we've seen changes in the mining sector. And so I've done some work with one of the mining companies in Tarapacá, in that region in northern Chile, looking at their community development program. And what we see from that community development is that although the numbers are quite large, so they invest $14 million per year in their communities, which is a very large development program, some of that development's not necessarily as strategic as you might expect. And some of it's invested in areas that perhaps is the reason why we weren't getting progress in those human development areas that we might expect if we had such a strong GDP. So I thought I'd present you with some of the data of crunching some of their numbers on community development. And there is not really a strategic approach when we see that the vast majority of spending, 70% of spending, is on content or development programs around sports, arts and culture, community health. Now, these issues, of course, are important and important to local communities, but they're also perhaps framed in a way that's more public relations focused than really leading to good community development outcomes. And if we were to try and think of the places that we might strategically invest our resources, perhaps they'd be more in this second category: enterprise development, education, social development, which is the minority of spending. And if you ask local communities, particularly around this operation in the Altiplano of northern Chile, what are the issues of concern to you? They would answer, well, indigenous issues and environmental issues. And we see that only 3% of spending is in that area. Okay, so what about what's strategic to the company geographically? So on this axis, we've got all of the towns in the region around the mining project, and we've got here the percentage of funding from that community development program. The yellow is the actual funding, and the green is what funding ought to be if we might take a strategic approach. So we did a strategic planning exercise with the community relations team, worked out what are the areas geographically that you should spend in, and we had a series of criteria. We ranked those regions, those locations by that criteria. Some of the criteria included, where the location of your employees are, is there high poverty in that area, is it a supplier of local business development, is it a location where the regional government might be located. There's a series of indicators. What we saw is most of the money is spent in the regional capital. And in fact, if you dig down into those projects, they're projects like investing in the heated swimming pool because the governor believed that the region is known for its swimming, so they wanted more Commonwealth and Olympic athletes. Or we saw a major investment in a museum to build a replica ship that had some cultural significance to Chile, or investing in churches and the like. This regional centre of Pica was the one that they had the longest community development history. It was up near the mine. We can see that there the actual spending matched what we might strategically spend, but other locations the spending was not as high as we might spend. Looking at population, because you could come back and say, well, we're spending in the location where there's greatest population. That might be true for the capital, although those recipients of that spending perhaps aren't the most needy. In the place where the workers lived, the actual spending was far less than what we might expect. And in fact, those workers were living in circumstances with low social services and access to the things that might make life more comfortable. And we shouldn't be surprised that there's been labour unrest in coming from those quarters. The other thing to say is that in the location where they had a long history of spending, they had been spending where there was a low population. So there's issues that we can tackle from different angles to make community development spending perhaps lead to some of those better outcomes that we're missing, that we talked about earlier. And of course, the thing we've learnt from the development community is that development needs to be about building independence from organisations, not building dependence on mining companies, for example. And so projects should be geared right towards projects that the idea came from the community, or the community helped to develop the project, or even better, the community was delivering the project. And we saw that of that $14 million that's been spent each year, a minority of the community were involved in the design and delivery of projects. So we've talked about the way in which mining might lead to community development. There's a flip side, and that is that mining is also a driver of social conflict in some locations. And I thought it'd be neat to look at some of the research we've been doing on mining and conflict. So I've been working with a colleague from the Harvard Kennedy School. Her name's Rachel Davis. She was involved in the Ruggie Mandate. And we decided to interview lots of folk in the mining industry and in international institutions, and also look at cases of mining community conflict. We looked at 50 cases of mining community conflict, and we looked at the issues in dispute, we looked at the manifestations of that conflict, and the costs that were being experienced by the company, but also some costs by community. We wanted to use that as a business case to drive change in the mining industry. So what we've got here in this graph is, as I described, the typology of mining and change earlier. Social and cultural change, economic change, socio-environmental change, and the process of change. And here we've got the proportion of cases here, of the 50 cases. And the black are the issues that we coded that were issues that were important for affecting the relationship between the mining company and the community, that were underlying or background factors, but weren't necessarily those issues in the white that were the proximate issues that precipitated the conflict. So what we see from this graph, other than there's heaps of issues that people have concern about and that are big factors in projects, it is that pollution and environmental issues tend to be the issues that are driving and precipitating conflict. But always behind that is this issue of a distribution of benefits, in an unfair and unequal distribution of costs and benefits, and also the issues of consent, consultation and communication, and culture and customs. They're kind of the take-home messages from that. A bunch of issues, but environment up front, socioeconomic in the background. And interestingly, we looked at the stage in the life cycle of projects where conflicts were happening. So we've got here from planning through to post-closure, and the number of cases that were coded at those particular life cycle stages. And you'll see, obviously, there's plenty of cases in the operations phase, because that's where most projects are at. But the overrepresentation that you see in feasibility and construction, I think, is striking. And particularly projects that were either abandoned at that stage because of community opposition, or were suspended at that stage because of community opposition. So you've got an overrepresentation of cases here. Can anyone hazard a guess as to why that might be the case? Okay, the thing that came to mind for me was that that's the first time in which impacts are being experienced by a community. Huge influx of construction workforce, they're starting to build the project, so there's a lot of impacts being experienced at that time. It's a time where community might mobilise. But I think it's deeper than that when you think about it. It's also that communities have, at that point in time, the ability to mobilise against projects. Because the capital hasn't been sunk in a landscape, the project isn't being willing to be defended by the government because so much investment's been spent. And once investment's been spent, it's really hard to change projects. So community knows that this is a leverage point in which it can affect change, and it can try and influence whether a project proceeds or how a project proceeds. But there are costs to communities of this. So if we look at the conflicts in the last 12 months, there's 14 cases where there's been a fatality from mine community conflict in the last 12 months, corresponding to 84 fatalities. A lot of them are in Marikana. We know that case of South Africa that occurred earlier in the year, in August, in the Platinum Belt there. But it's a wide geography that there's lots of fatalities. But there's also lots of costs to companies. And if companies knew the costs better, I think it would drive internal change about how they deal with relationships with communities. The big costs, the most frequent costs were lost productivity due to delay. We're talking $20 million a week being lost for delay of a project from community opposition. The biggest costs are when projects are abandoned, so they're asset write-offs, but also the inability to develop that resource, which is a bigger number indeed, in the billions usually. And even in the case of Conga, you've had a suspension of that project because of community unrest. $900 million was spent in the last 3 years in the construction stage. So it's a lot of money to be experienced as a cost if in fact that project doesn't proceed. And also the additional staff time is the most often overlooked cost. So there's a good business case here for companies doing things better. So how might we as change agents deliver the changes that are needed to bring the mining industries to deliver better outcomes for communities, better environmental outcomes, and lead to social progress and human development? There's different models of change as I see it. The big driver is local community, and the data I presented before is a real demonstration that community can influence large multinational companies and the success of or not of those projects. Another driver is obviously civil society and campaigns demanding change on the mining industry, and I think that has been a key feature of the mining industry's shift from a rejectionist position around sustainable development to an accommodationist one. But there are other ways. So international institutions have soft regulation, whether it's on financing or whether it's through certification schemes or other methods that institutions can influence company behaviour. Governments play a key role, and I think that we've seen strengthening of policy and legislation, particularly in the social performance space over the last decade or so. But it's countervailing trends. We've also seen places go backwards. And research institutes, so here at CSRM, we see ourselves as constructive engagement with the industry to try and deliver on the change that's being demanded by communities and civil society. But there's also a role for critical reflection. And this other category that we often forget and sometimes marginalise, of professionals working inside the industry as internal change agents, trying to drive better environmental social performance and win arguments inside companies. And they can be supported by all of the other actors outside and drive reforms based on the demands that have been made by civil society, local community, etc. So here at the Centre for Social Responsibility in Mining, we mainly work in environmental social performance of the resources sector. We're a group of 30 researchers, 15 or so PhD students, and we've worked with most of the major mining companies and a whole host of actors, including governments, international institutions, and some civil society groups. So happy to take some questions or leave it to the discussion later, in fact, and welcome any time if you'd like to contact me and ask anything about what I've presented tonight. Thank you.